There is a photograph taken somewhere around 1910 of a street in downtown Toronto that looks nothing like downtown Toronto. The road is unpaved. The buildings are small and close together. Their storefronts painted in languages that are not English: Hebrew, Yiddish, Italian, Ukrainian. Children are sitting on wooden steps. A man is pushing a cart. Laundry hangs between the buildings on lines strung from window to window. And the whole street has the quality of a place that is intensely, almost overwhelmingly alive, dense with people and noise and commerce, and the particular energy of communities that have arrived somewhere new and are in the process of making it their own. The street in that photograph no longer exists. Not in the sense that it has changed or been redeveloped or lost its original character to gentrification. It does not exist in a more complete and final way than that. It was erased. The ground it stood on is now a public square. A very famous public square, actually. One of the most recognizable civic spaces in the country, photographed a million times, skated on every winter, the backdrop for rallies and concerts and New Year's celebrations, and every kind of public gathering that a city uses to remind itself it is a city. Nathan Phillips Square. The reflecting pool. The curved towers of the new city hall rising behind it. The arch. The eternal flame. All of it built on top of a neighborhood that the city decided, in the middle of the 20th century, was not a neighborhood at all. This is the story of the ward. To understand the ward, you have to go back to the 1880s. And to understand the 1880s, you have to understand what Toronto was to the people arriving in it. The city was growing with a speed that its existing social infrastructure could barely absorb. Ships from Europe were discharging passengers at the docks with increasing regularity. Jews fleeing the pogroms of Eastern Europe, Italians leaving the poverty of the South, Ukrainians, Poles, Russians, Chinese workers who had survived the construction of the Canadian Pacific Railway and stayed, each community landing in a country that had no particular plan for them and a varying degree of enthusiasm for their arrival. They needed somewhere to go, somewhere cheap enough to afford on nothing, somewhere close enough to the city's markets and factories and shops that they could walk to work, because they could not afford anything else. They went to the ward. The ward, officially St. John's Ward. The municipal designation that covered roughly the blocks bounded by College Street to the north, Queen Street to the south, Yonge Street to the east, and University Avenue to the west, was the oldest and poorest residential district in the city's core. Its housing stock was already aging by the time the great waves of immigration began filling it. The houses were small, many of them subdivided into rooming arrangements that stretched the meaning of the word accommodation. The streets were unpaved for longer than the streets anywhere else in the city. The city's services, garbage collection, water, sanitation, arrived here last and left first. And into this place, decade after decade, came the people the rest of the city had no room for. What grew in the ward was not, despite everything that was stacked against it, a slum in the way that word is usually deployed, as a place of pure deprivation defined entirely by what it lacked. What grew was a community. Several communities overlapping and intertwined, sharing streets and markets, and the particular intimacy that comes from living close together in difficult circumstances. The Jewish community was the largest and most established through the early decades. On Agnes Street and Terrelli Street and Elizabeth Street, there were synagogues and kosher butchers, and Yiddish newspapers and social clubs and political organizations that debated in several languages simultaneously the great questions of Jewish life in the diaspora. There were scholars who had fled the Pale of Settlement with nothing but the contents of their minds, and who continued in rented rooms above grocery stores in Toronto the intellectual traditions that the pogroms had tried to destroy. There were labor organizers who had learned their politics in the factories of Warsaw and were now applying them to the garment trades of King Street. There were people who had survived things that the comfortable citizens of Rosedale and the Annex could not have imagined, and who were, despite everything, building something new. The Italian community clustered on its own streets, maintaining the social structures of the villages they had left, the mutual aid societies, the feast days, the informal networks of employment and credit that allowed people to survive in an economy that was not designed with them in mind. The Chinese community, Small and subject to legal restrictions that no other group in the city faced, maintained its own internal economy along Elizabeth Street, with a tenacity that the hostility of the surrounding city made necessary rather than optional. They were not separate. That is the thing about the ward that the people who lived there remembered most clearly decades later when the researchers and the historians came to ask. It was not a collection of isolated ethnic enclaves sitting beside each other in mutual incomprehension. It was a place where communities that had every reason to remain separate chose, in the daily friction of shared streets and shared markets and shared hardship, to become something more complicated and more interesting than that. A Jewish family bought vegetables from an Italian cart. Ukrainian families sent their children to the same public school as the children of a family that had come from Russia. The ward was not utopian. There was prejudice inside it, as there is prejudice inside every human community. But it was plural in a way that the rest of Toronto in those years emphatically was not. And it produced people. This is the part that the planners who eventually demolished it never quite reckoned with. The ward was not simply a place where the poor lived. It was a place where the poor became something else, where the children of the cart vendors and the garment workers and the street peddlers went to school and to university and into the professions and into the arts and into public life, where the density and the energy and the fierce, pressurized ambition of a community that had come from nowhere and intended to go somewhere produced generation after generation, people who shaped the city that was simultaneously trying to push them out of it. The push was constant, and it came from the beginning. Toronto's civic establishment looked at the ward with a mixture of pity and alarm from the moment it began to fill. The newspapers ran periodic features on its conditions. The overcrowding, the inadequate sanitation, the poverty that were ostensibly sympathetic and frequently condescending, treating the community's residents as objects of social concern rather than as citizens with their own voice and their own assessment of what they needed. Medical health officers issued reports. Social reformers organized missions. The city's middle-class conscience visited the ward and wrote about what it found there, with the particular tone of people who have encountered something that disturbs them and are not entirely sure whether the disturbance is compassion or revulsion. What the civic establishment never quite entertained during the long decades when it was producing reports and expressing concern about the ward was the possibility that the community might simply be left alone to continue doing what it was already doing. Housing people, generating commerce, producing citizens, functioning as the unglamorous but essential intake mechanism through which wave after wave of immigrants entered the city and eventually became part of it. That possibility was overtaken by something larger. By the late 1940s and early 1950s, Toronto had a vision of itself that the ward did not fit into. The city was growing up, or believed it was. The downtown core was being reimagined as a place of glass and civic grandeur and modernist architecture, a proper metropolitan center for a city that was becoming, by some measures, the most important in the country. The old buildings were embarrassments, the narrow streets were inefficiencies, and the ward, sitting on some of the most valuable land in the center of the city, densely populated by communities that did not have the political power to defend themselves, was something that civic ambition could not see past. The decision to demolish it was not made all at once. It accumulated through the 1940s and 1950s in the way that urban renewal decisions tend to accumulate, through zoning changes, through the withdrawal of city services, through the acquisition of parcels by the city as properties came available, through a process of managed decline in which the area was allowed to deteriorate in ways that then justified the argument that it was beyond saving. The buildings got older, the investments stopped coming. The middle-class Jewish families who had the means to leave moved to Kensington Market and the Annex and Forest Hill, following the pattern of upward mobility that was the ward's most consistent product. What remained was the poorest and most vulnerable part of the community, the people with the least capacity to absorb what was coming. What was coming was City Hall. The decision to build a new Toronto City Hall was itself a remarkable story of civic ambition. a global design competition won by the Finnish architect Viljo Ravel, whose twin curved towers and flying saucer council chamber remains one of the most genuinely striking pieces of modernist architecture on the continent. The building was bold and strange and confident, and the city was proud of it in a way it had not been proud of much civic architecture since the original City Hall on Queen Street. It opened in 1965 to enormous celebration. The square in front of it, Nathan Phillips Square, named for the mayor who championed the new City Hall through years of opposition, required the complete clearance of the blocks to the south and west of the new building. The streets of the ward that had not already been demolished were demolished now. Elizabeth Street, Turali Street, Center Street, Agnes Street. The houses and the storefronts and the synagogues and the social clubs and the rooming houses, all of it cleared. The land was regraded. The reflecting pool was installed. The concrete was poured. And on the ground where the cart vendors had pushed their carts and the children had sat on the wooden steps and the laundry had hung between the buildings, Toronto built a place for itself to gather. The people who were displaced from the ward did not, for the most part, leave records. The city did not concern itself overly with what happened to them. There were some relocation payments. There were, in some cases, social workers involved. But the community, as a community, the specific, accumulated, intergenerational network of relationships and institutions and shared memory that had been built in those streets over 7 decades, that could not be relocated. It was a thing that existed in a place, and when the place was destroyed, it ceased to exist. The last residents of the ward were moved out by the early 1960s. The demolition proceeded. By the time the Queen's Park Urban Renewal Program finished its work on the blocks surrounding the new City Hall, there was almost nothing left that would have been recognizable to someone who had lived in the ward in 1920. A few buildings on the margins, the outline of a street here and there, and beneath the new paving, 3 or 4 meters down, the archaeological evidence that researchers would spend decades carefully excavating, the broken dishes, the medicine bottles, the discarded tools, the small material fragments of lives lived in a place that the city had decided to forget. The archaeology of the ward, when it was eventually done seriously, produced something extraordinary. Not treasures, not the kind of objects that end up behind glass in a museum display case, but evidence. Evidence of how people actually lived. Which foods they ate, which medicines they used, which objects they valued enough to keep, and which they discarded. Evidence of a community's daily life, preserved by accident in the soil beneath a parking lot or a service road, surviving because it had been buried deep enough to escape the demolition crews. It is, in the most literal possible sense, the ghost of a neighborhood. Existing underground, beneath the square, beneath the curved towers and the reflecting pool and the eternal flame, in the form of broken fragments that no one intended to preserve and that survived only because the act of demolishing a place also, paradoxically, buries it. Nathan Phillips Square is not a bad place. That is the uncomfortable part of this story, and it is worth saying plainly. The square genuinely functions as the civic heart of the city in ways that matter. The skating rink fills every winter with people who have nowhere else in the city to skate for free. The rallies and the protests and the concerts and the public gatherings that happen there are real expressions of democratic life. The architecture is, by any serious measure, remarkable. The city did not replace the ward with nothing. It replaced it with something it valued, and the value was real. But the question that Nathan Phillips Square will not let you stop asking, if you know what it was built on, is who decides what progress means? Who decides that a neighborhood of working people is a problem to be solved, rather than a place to be improved? Who decides that the correct response to poverty and overcrowding is demolition rather than investment, erasure rather than repair? Who decides that the city's need for a grand civic gesture outweighs the community's right to remain? In Toronto in the 1950s, those decisions were made by people who did not live in the ward. By planners and politicians and civic boosters who looked at the dense, noisy, multilingual streets of the old immigrant neighborhood and saw dysfunction where the people who lived there saw home. Who looked at the buildings and saw blight where the residents saw the physical infrastructure of a life being built. Who looked at the community and saw a problem that needed solving, rather than a city in the process of becoming itself. The ward produced an argument that Toronto is still having. About who the city is for, about what gets demolished and what gets preserved, about the difference between renewing a city and erasing the people who made it, about the specific recurring pattern in which the communities with the least political power occupy the land that the powerful eventually decide they need, and the way that pattern has repeated itself across the city's history with a consistency that is difficult to call accidental. The people of the ward built something real in those streets. They built it out of almost nothing, in difficult circumstances, in a city that was not always glad to have them. They built institutions and businesses and networks of mutual support, and most importantly, they built the next generation. The children and grandchildren who became the lawyers and doctors and artists and politicians and business owners who shaped the city that demolished the neighborhood they came from. The city that stands on the ground of the ward today is, in significant part, the city that the ward produced. It does not remember. It does not mark the streets that were there, or the names of the families who lived on them, or the synagogues that stood on the corners, or the social clubs that met in the rooms above the grocery stores. There is a small historical plaque. There is the archaeology, still ongoing, still producing fragments. There is the photograph from 1910 of the unpaved street with the laundry on the lines and the children on the steps, held in an archive somewhere, waiting for someone to look at it. And there is Nathan Phillips Square, full of people on a winter afternoon, skates on the ice, the curved towers reflected in the rink, the eternal flame burning at the far end. Built on ground that once knew something about what it meant to arrive somewhere with nothing, and build something anyway. If you like this type of content and would like to learn more about the environment that surrounds us, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to this channel. Stay tuned for more.